Genesis 1 is one of the most recognized creation accounts in the world. But when examined closely, many readers notice inconsistencies, scientific challenges, and interpretive problems. Today, we'll break down some of the most debated issues people point out in Genesis 1, not to offend believers, but to explore how ancient texts clash with modern understanding. Let's dive into 5 major areas where critics argue Genesis 1 raises questions.
One of the biggest challenges comes right at the beginning. Genesis 1 states that light was created on the first day, but the sun, moon, and stars weren't created until the 4th day. Critics argue this raises a major logical and scientific problem. Light, as we understand it, is a product of energy sources, primarily stars like the sun. Without these celestial bodies, where does the light come from? Apologists often say God himself could be the source of that light, but others see this as a retroactive explanation that doesn't align with observable reality. Skeptics also question how days could be measured without the sun to mark time. If day and night are defined by Earth's rotation relative to the sun, the first 3 days don't make much sense in literal terms.
This conflict between scripture and science encourages many Christians to interpret the creation account symbolically rather than literally. The tension between faith-based interpretations and natural laws is one of the most debated aspects of the text. Genesis 1 presents a step-by-step process of creation, but critics say the order doesn't align with scientific evidence. For example, vegetation is said to appear on the 3rd day, before the creation of the sun. Plants depend on sunlight for photosynthesis, so without the sun, this chronology feels problematic. Additionally, the creation of Earth before the stars, galaxies, or even the universe contradicts what cosmology tells us. Scientists confirm that stars and galaxies formed long before Earth. Skeptics contend that the biblical timeline doesn't match any model of planetary formation. Apologists counter these critiques by invoking metaphor or divine mystery, but this doesn't satisfy those looking for consistency with natural processes. Another example is the separation of waters above and below the sky, an ancient worldview rooted in a flat Earth cosmology. These sequences reflect a pre-scientific understanding of the cosmos, not a modern one. While some readers adopt symbolic or poetic interpretations, literal readers struggle to reconcile this with today's knowledge. Another frequently criticized part of Genesis 1 is the concept of the firmament. The text describes a solid dome that separates the waters above from the waters below. This made sense in the ancient Near Eastern worldview, where people believed the sky was a hard structure holding back cosmic waters. Critics argue that this language reflects mythology more than reality. In modern times, we know the atmosphere is not a dome, and there are no waters stored above the sky. Some modern translators replace firmament with expanse to soften the imagery, but the original Hebrew word rakia implies something solid. Skeptics point out that this outdated model suggests the text was written for people with limited scientific understanding, rather than offering divine revelation meant for all ages. Supporters may say the language is poetic or figurative, but critics argue that if the text is meant to be literal history, these inaccuracies undermine that claim. This debate drives ongoing discussion about interpretation. Genesis 1 portrays humans as the pinnacle of creation, made in God's image on the 6th day, after animals. But scientific evidence shows humans evolved over millions of years alongside other species. Critics say this doesn't match the sudden appearance described in the text. There's also debate about the dominion given to humanity over all creatures. This tension between symbolic meaning and literal description fuels disagreement even among believers. While Genesis 1 gives a structured 6-day creation, Genesis 2 presents a different sequence. In Genesis 2, man appears before plants and animals, unlike the order in Genesis 1. Critics highlight this as evidence that the two accounts come from different sources or traditions. This raises the question, if the Bible is divinely inspired and perfect, why do the creation orders differ? Some theologians attempt to harmonize the accounts by saying Genesis 2 rewinds the narrative to focus on humanity, not chronology. However, skeptics argue that the contradictions are too direct to ignore.
The language, tone, and order show signs of multiple authorship. These differences suggest ancient storytellers compiled traditions rather than delivering a single unified revelation. For many, this challenges the notion of Genesis as literal, consistent history. Genesis 1 repeatedly uses the phrase evening and morning to mark each day of creation, but critics raise the issue of what day actually means in this context. The Hebrew word yom can indicate a 24-hour cycle or a longer, undefined period. If the text is literal, then each creation event happened in a single Earth day, which conflicts with modern cosmology, geology, and biology. Earth formed over billions of years, and species emerged gradually. On the other hand, if day is metaphorical, some argue it undermines the plain reading believers often use to promote a literal worldview. Skeptics also question how there could be evenings and mornings before the sun existed, which wasn't created until day 4. Some apologists defend the timeline by suggesting God established a temporary source of light, or that the wording is symbolic rather than scientific. These differing interpretations create internal tension within Christian communities. Literalists and progressive theologians often clash over whether Genesis 1 is intended as history, poetry, or theological metaphor. The ambiguity of the word day adds another layer of conflict between ancient scripture and modern understanding, making it one of the most debated language issues in the chapter. Genesis 1 describes God separating the waters, placing some above the firmament and some below it. This reflects an outdated cosmology shared by other ancient Near Eastern cultures, where a solid sky was believed to hold back celestial waters. Critics argue that this concept doesn't align with any level of scientific knowledge. There are no literal waters stored above Earth's atmosphere. Some believers reinterpret the verse metaphorically, saying it refers to clouds or water vapor. However, the original language implies a physical separation, not a poetic image. Skeptics also point to flood narratives that rely on these upper waters being released, reinforcing the ancient worldview behind the text. Supporters may argue that God was simply communicating in terms people of the time could understand. But critics say that if the text is divinely inspired and timeless, it should transcend primitive cosmology. This tension leads many people to see Genesis as a cultural product rather than a scientific statement. The imagery of separated waters has become emblematic of the larger challenge, interpreting ancient religious texts through the lens of modern knowledge without diminishing either faith or intellectual integrity. Genesis 1 divides living creatures into broad categories, such as creeping things, beasts, and birds of the air. Critics note that these groupings don't reflect the complex biological classifications used today. There's no mention of microorganisms, aquatic mammals, dinosaurs, arthropods beyond vague terms, or any evolutionary lineage. Instead, the text shows a simplistic taxonomy based on an ancient observational lens. Some apologists argue that the Bible wasn't meant to deliver scientific detail, only theological truth. However, critics replied that a literal reading, often promoted in religious communities, creates contradictions with known biology. The text also places animals on land before the creation of humans, but this doesn't reflect evolutionary history, where humans and animals share a long, branching ancestry. Another issue is the lack of distinction between domesticated and wild species, insects, or marine reptiles, which implies the writers were focused on everyday creatures familiar to ancient people. Skeptics believe this further supports the idea that Genesis 1 is a human cultural document rather than a divine explanation of biodiversity. The broad, imprecise categories highlight how far science and scripture differ in describing the living world. Critical scholars argue that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 were written by different authors or traditions, often referred to as the priestly, P, and Yahwist, J, sources. The structured, repetitive style in Genesis 1, with refrains like, "and God said," and "it was good," differs sharply from the more narrative, conversational tone of Genesis 2. Skeptics see this as evidence that Genesis wasn't written by a single person such as Moses, as traditionally believed, but compiled over time from separate traditions.
Believers who defend divine inspiration often claim both accounts were intentionally complementary, offering different perspectives. Still, critics say the differences in order, language, and theological focus are too significant to ignore. Genesis 1 emphasizes cosmic order and divine command, while Genesis 2 focuses on human relationships and earthly details. The possibility of multiple authors complicates the idea of inerrancy, since two different sequences can't both be literally correct. This leads to debates about redaction, oral tradition, and the purpose of ancient storytelling. For those who prioritize literary or historical accuracy, these authorship questions raise doubts about Genesis as a unified, flawless document. Genesis 1 reflects values and concerns rooted in the ancient world, and critics say these cultural imprints reveal its human origins. The command to subdue the earth and have dominion over living creatures suggests a hierarchical worldview where humans wield unquestioned authority. In modern ethical conversations, this language has been criticized for encouraging exploitation of nature rather than stewardship. Additionally, the binary framing of created beings, light and darkness, land and sea, male and female, doesn't account for complexities observed in the world today. Critics note that strict binaries oversimplify everything from gender diversity to ecological relationships. Apologists may argue the language is broad, symbolic, and oriented toward essential categories rather than exhaustive details. However, skeptics respond that this still shows the text's limitations. They see it as a record of how ancient people tried to explain existence with the knowledge and cultural norms available to them. Rather than universal science or philosophy, Genesis 1 presents a worldview bound by time and context. These cultural fingerprints challenge the idea that the chapter represents an unchanging, universal truth meant to apply seamlessly in every era. Critics often highlight that the sequence of creation in Genesis 1 doesn't logically track with natural processes. For instance, dry land appears before the sun, and birds are mentioned before other land animals in some interpretations. Geological evidence shows Earth's formation was shaped by billions of years of volcanic activity, plate tectonics, and atmospheric changes, not by sudden divine commands completed in single days. The three-tiered arrangement of sky, land, and sea reflects ancient cosmology rather than scientific models. Additionally, the concept of plants existing before sunlight is not only biologically implausible, but undermines the internal coherence of the passage if taken literally. Symbolic readers argue that Genesis was never meant as a physics lesson. However, literal believers often insist that the order is historically accurate, which creates friction with scientific education. The structure of the text follows a poetic symmetry, forming realms in the first 3 days and filling them in the next 3. Critics see this as literary craftsmanship rather than eyewitness chronology. The tension between narrative structure and natural law continues to be a major sticking point in modern discussions of Genesis 1. The wording of Genesis 1 has been translated across languages for centuries, and critics point out how translation choices affect meaning. Terms like firmament, kind, day, and dominion don't always capture the nuance of the original Hebrew. For instance, kind has been used by creationists to argue for limits to evolution, but the Hebrew term may simply reflect general groupings rather than fixed biological categories. The word rakia, often softened to expanse, literally refers to something hammered out like metal, suggesting a solid dome. When translations update wording to suit modern understanding, skeptics say this amounts to retrofitting the text to avoid conflict with science. The phrase, "be fruitful and multiply," also raises questions about whether the text addresses populations, stewardship, or reproductive command. These shifting translations show how interpretation can evolve to preserve relevance. Critics argue that if divine revelation were clear and unchanging, interpretation wouldn't need to depend so heavily on translator preference. Apologists counter that language changes, but truth remains. Yet this doesn't satisfy those who expect clarity from a sacred text. A major source of controversy surrounding Genesis 1 is whether it should be taken literally or symbolically. Literalists argue the text describes historical events exactly as they happened, including a six-day creation and a recent Earth. Symbolic readers see the account as poetic theology, an ancient narrative meant to express divine purpose rather than provide scientific facts. Critics note that this divide exists not only between believers and skeptics, but within religious traditions themselves. The shift to symbolic interpretation often coincided with scientific advancements, suggesting to critics that reinterpretation was reactive rather than original. They argue that if the text was always symbolic, why did so many believers insist for centuries on literal readings? Literal interpretations create conflict with evolution, cosmology, and geology, while symbolic readings raise questions about which parts of Scripture are metaphorical and which are factual. Skeptics believe this selective flexibility weakens the authority of the text. Meanwhile, many moderate believers view Genesis 1 as a theological statement about God's sovereignty rather than a scientific explanation of origins. Genesis 1 repeatedly uses the phrase, "and God said," to describe creation occurring by divine command rather than process. Critics argue that this depiction reflects mythic storytelling typical of ancient cultures, where gods speak worlds into existence. There is no observation, mechanism, or gradual unfolding, only immediate results. Skeptics claim this framework is incompatible with what we now understand about natural processes like stellar formation, abiogenesis, and biological evolution. The repetition in the text also suggests a liturgical or poetic structure rather than historical reporting. Apologists sometimes respond that divine command is beyond scientific explanation, so natural process isn't required. Critics counter that invoking supernatural means places the text outside verifiable reality, making it indistinguishable from the myths of other ancient civilizations. They also note that humans in the ancient world used stories to explain existence in ways that modern knowledge replaces with evidence-based models. The motif of command-based creation appeals to believers, but for critics, it reinforces the idea that Genesis is theological literature rather than empirical description. One of the biggest criticisms of Genesis 1 is that it shows no awareness of scientific principles now considered basic: gravity, orbit, atmospheric formation, cellular life, or geological time. Critics argue that a truly divine text would transcend the limited worldview of ancient writers. Instead, Genesis reflects the observational perspective of a person standing on Earth, seeing sky above, land beneath, and water around. There is no mention of stars as distant suns, galaxies, atoms, or ecosystems. The Earth is center stage, suggesting a geocentric mindset. Skeptics say this proves the text came from human imagination rather than divine knowledge. Believers often respond that the text wasn't intended to teach science, but to communicate purpose and identity. However, critics point out that many readers still treat it like a literal historical record, especially in debates over evolution and education. The absence of scientific insight leads critics to conclude that Genesis 1 belongs to the mythological literature of its time, rather than offering insight into the actual origins of the universe. Genesis 1:27 states that God created humans, male and female, which critics argue oversimplifies the complexity of human sex and gender. The binary framing doesn't account for intersex conditions, gender identity variations, or the broader spectrum recognized in modern science and psychology. Some religious readers argue the verse speaks in general categories rather than exhaustive biological possibilities. Still, skeptics say it illustrates how the text reflects ancient cultural norms rather than timeless knowledge. Additionally, the pairing of male and female is often linked to reproductive purposes, suggesting that the text frames humanity in terms of procreation rather than individuality or identity. This issue adds to the broader argument that Genesis 1 describes humanity in simplified, culturally bound terms rather than universal or scientifically accurate ones.
The directive in Genesis 1:28 for humans to subdue the earth and have dominion over animals has sparked debate about environmental ethics. Critics argue that this language creates a hierarchy where humans are superior to nature rather than part of it, potentially encouraging environmental exploitation.